Welcome back to the Dossier Project. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, like, save. If you like our content, go ahead and share it with your friends. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about something a little strange to most people, maybe haven't heard these terms used in this way, but we're going to talk about the difference between process and content. And that's more like process is more like the how we do something, and the content is more like what we're actually doing. And we found ourselves in a lot of our conversations talking about process a lot and realized that a lot of our viewers may not understand why we typically don't get into the nitty gritty or the details or the content of our conversations and tend to stay more in process. And there are some really good reasons for that, but we want to make sure we don't lose you guys in the process. So, what we're going to do today is just quickly give you guys a little bit of the pros and cons of each, both process and content, or the how and the what. And then we're going to share a little bit more about why we tend to focus on process more than content in a lot of our conversations. So, ladies, what about it? What are some pros and cons of process versus content?
So I was thinking, for examples, like in my own life, how I've used both. And what struck me pretty quickly when I think about process and content, I think of process, yes, as a how, or I think of it as the generalization. And the content is the specific of a particular instance of the thing. So really good example, took prenatal classes when I was pregnant, and they gave us the process of labor. You learn what the general milestones are, what the progression of labor is, what to expect. It's very generalized. And content is, when I read Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, where there's a bunch of personal stories of personal labor journeys, birth stories. And both of those were extremely useful for me in preparing to go through labor myself. So I think the pros of process in particular can be, it's more applicable to more people. The specific of one person's birth story doesn't necessarily help me understand, build the first picture of what I might be going through, but the generalization does help me start to form that understanding of what might happen. But I really found reading individual stories very useful as well, because it gave me details and it made it richer to think about how does that generalized labor process work. So I found the combination of actually both process and content there extremely useful, but it was much better to start with process because it gave me the basics and gave me the more like guaranteed labor is pretty predictable in certain ways of what's going to progress body wise. And then there's a whole bunch of variables, but it was really helpful for me to grab in my brain the reliable things that are going to happen and then later fill in all the like, this might happen, but it might go this way, or you might make this choice, or you might be offered this other choice, or, you know, all these particulars that may come up, but may not. Those would have been overwhelming at first and would have been quite meaningless without understanding the process and having the framework in place in my mind first. So that's my personal example of how both are useful. And for me, it's very helpful in learning when you can separate out the process and the content and kind of acquire it in the process part first and then the content part later.
Thanks, Lee. And I think while you were talking, it's like, how do I do that? And, you know, you've heard the phrase, like, how you do one thing is how you do everything. And that's to me what means like process. Like I have a way that I do my life, you know, and I find like for me, specific examples that I can see. For example, I know if I'm disciplined in one area of my life, I tend to be disciplined in another area, you know, and vice versa too. If I'm undisciplined in one area, I tend to be undisciplined in others. And I call my two vices like sugar and shopping. So I know that if I'm eating a lot of sugar, I tend to be buying a lot of things and just kind of like want that quick fix, you know. So and when I'm disciplined and like, you know, watching my calories or my budget, same thing, different areas, same process, different content areas. Another example is I do sales. And so how you sell one thing, it's like sales is a process, and it's not that different. And it can apply to whether you're selling for, you know, whatever, a product or a service, or you're selling in terms of, dating, like we're all selling ourselves. Like if everyone thinks they're not a salesman, that if they're in a relationship, or, you're always selling something, oftentimes it's ourself or whatever. So those are two examples that I think, and I agree, it's the generalization, so it's relatable, and then the content for me is like examples, so it's specific and I can understand, with concrete examples, so it's not just abstract.
Yeah, when I think about it in terms of relationships, like I think of like how people get really charged about politics. I think I used to come from more liberal leaning background area, and more recently in my life, I used to not even be able to feel like I could listen to Republicans or someone that had a different opinion than me when it comes to politics. And I would just be like, no, like these people are bad, and I can't relate to them. But what I wasn't looking at is that usually the thing I was criticizing someone on the other aisle about, I was doing by not even giving them the time of day or even being willing to listen to them. So this is like a concept that I never really thought about, honestly, really until I started taking classes in ESP, because I was more in the social justice world and it was a lot of like us versus them. So it didn't really open me up to just understanding people who had different opinions than me. And when I started to kind of look at, well, why would someone think this way? And I started to really see a lot of times, people were going for the same thing. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants to be understood. But the methods by which people think we can get there are very different. So once I started to kind of get out of the like, well, this is the way I think about things, and this is, it's wrong the way someone else thinks about things. I started to actually see more commonalities and have more empathy for people, which was great because I was a kind of person where I was just like, I want to connect more with people, and I really saw how that was very limiting. So I have a lot of like friends now, and even some family members who are in like the diversity social justice world that I used to be in, and I find that I'm a lot more open, whereas some of those people are still like, well, really advocating for what they're criticizing. For example, like discrimination, really. Like when it comes to race relations, I think there's a lot of times Black folks who are like, white people shouldn't be allowed in these spaces. And I can understand that to a degree, but I really see it as, if that was white people saying no Black people are allowed in this space, people would be up in arms about it, So I think it's a difficult thing to bring to light when people are really committed to like what they think is more correct. But I think if you can kind of get away from the content in those spaces, sometimes you can really see that there's more options, because ultimately, I think at the end of the day, people are really fighting for similar things. So,
yeah, for me, I look at it a lot of times in relationships, with people that I care about, or there's certain processes that happen, and it's in the end, it's often we start arguing about the content, meaning, so whether it's being late, like I have an appointment with someone and I'm late, and then they get angry because I'm late. So that's the argument point. But what I then start to discover is more that the argument isn't really about the lateness, because actually, with other people, they don't get angry about them being late, or they're late themselves a lot of the time, or things like that. But at the end, what they're really arguing about, or what they're angry about, is that they don't feel respected by me, they don't feel seen by me. And so rather than us fighting about the lateness or not lateness, we can address more what really the issue is, like what's really going on that they're reacting to, that they're angry about, that they feel upset about, which mostly isn't about the actual content. Because if you take the same content, meaning someone being late, and you apply it to different situations, they're not always going to be angry. They have different reactions. So I find the content, is a way to help find out what's really going on in a more like how they're feeling, or what it means to them that this specific situation happened. So I find it easier to understand in any given conflict what's really going on for someone by looking at the content, by looking at the process and the content.
So I think in general, what I'm hearing, like if I just look at some of the pros and cons of both, process is super helpful to get us out of the emotionality or out of any of the like biases or like our vested viewpoints, and allows us to have a conversation not in the actual content of the thing. So it allows us to actually get to the issue and have a conversation above that. If it's too general and it's too far in process, then oftentimes it's not relatable. Or for example, in like a legal position, certainly you need data, or you need content specificity to be able to see, was this crime committed? Is there evidence? Is there proof? You need, and in science, it's the same thing. You need those details to know, okay, yes, this actually happened, kind of a thing. So for accountability, for measurability, for all of those things, I think content is very helpful, to avoid biases, discrimination, emotional biases, and get stuck fighting in things that aren't necessarily relevant. Process is much more helpful. So in general, just with that, keeping that in mind, and with that summary, I think the reason that we wind up speaking about process more than we do content is because in a lot of the issues that we're talking about, they're very emotionally charged, whether it's the Israel-Gaza situation, whether it's a legal situation, people being imprisoned wrongfully, whether it's, male-female dynamics and gender biases and things like that. A lot of the issues that we talk about are very emotionally charged. And staying in the content can oftentimes lead to, as Sahajo astutely pointed out, we get stuck in those content points and not actually able to have a conversation about, is the way we're doing things, is the how we're doing things actually helpful to all humans? We start to be able to see a human in front of us. We start to be able to relate differently outside of getting stuck in the content. So I don't know if you ladies see anything else, but in general, I think that's typically why our conversations are had more in the process or the how than the what.
I would add, we're not experts in a lot of the things we talk about, and then we could claim to be experts. I mean, we're experts in our personal experience. Anytime we're sharing our personal experience of something, obviously we can and often do give details and of the content because we can. But if we're going to be talking in general, like I'm going to talk about relationships, like, well, I know what my, relationships are like, but I don't know what other people's relationships are like. And I'm certainly not going to comment on the details of a relationship I don't have intimate information about. So, if we're reading about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, like I know what's in the newspaper, but I'm not that interested in the story to have read lots of it. So for the most part, talking about the process is something I can talk about. And because we're generalizing it, it's not specific to what particularly happened on that night in that year where this and that and the other supposedly, allegedly, possibly happened, between Johnny and Amber. Like we don't have to get into that because that's quite debatable. And that could really derail my argument. If I'm basing an argument on that particular content, then, well, if I'm wrong, that goes out the window. So forget that. We can use that as a springboard to talk about more the relationships, romantic relationships between men and women, power dynamics in a close relationship with any other human being, whatever. We can use that as the inspiration for a discussion that can be very rich and meaningful, but doesn't rely on the content being accurate, because we can't guarantee that all the content we talk about other people and other events is accurate. So instead of getting into that kind of debate, let's just talk about process, because that's where more learning and meaningfulness can happen, given that we're not experts. But I think it's useful to share our own content where we can, assert ourselves as experts. Like, this is what happened in my life. This is my experience of my relationship. That type of thing is also rich and meaningful, and quite frankly, maybe more interesting than talking about the generalized. I understand that too. I think
just to add a little bit, when you see several examples of something also, then it kind of indicates a pattern. And that's, if the generalization doesn't come just out of thin air or in a vacuum, it comes from several examples. I could see like the role of media and trial by media and so forth. It's just like whether it's Johnny Depp or Russell Brand, you see several examples of this that leads to maybe a generalization or the process of media, and the role. So that's, helpful, I think. And you can't, it's not conclusive, but when there's, correlation, at least, I think it's helpful to understand.
Awesome. So if there's nothing else, then I hope this gives you guys a better idea of the differences between process and content, or the how and the what, and also why we tend to focus on process in a lot of our conversations. So I hope this helps the content be more relatable to you in your life and more useful. And if you guys have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Again, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. If you find this content helpful, go ahead and like it, share it with your friends, and we will see you in the next conversation.